Welcome to The Christian Atheist, Episode 11, Afterthoughts. Last week, we completed a 7-week series entitled The Machinery of the Looking Glass, an attempt to trace my faith journey from atheism back to Christ. In any such account, much must be shaved off, passed over, and ignored in order to tell the story within the given constraints. This week, I would like to address some of those shavings that deserve attention. First, though, one personal wrap-up. In the course of a year, old lives and patterns have been burned to the ground, and a newness has replaced them. It is difficult to express how total a transformation was wrought in the lives of Jenny and I, and how good God has been to us. We have found new life. In leaving our past, we live and focus forward. We regret any pain to others in the wake of this process, and pray God's blessing on each and every one who felt or feels its sting. I began this series by asking myself why I was so concerned about the aesthetics of the Old Testament sacrificial system in the 4th edition of The Christian Atheist. Why it presented such a stumbling block for me. We are now in a position to answer this question. I find atheism and theism both rational responses to our world and experience. On what basis, then, did I choose to step back through the looking glass to belief in God if it wasn't compelled by rationality? Well, perhaps it was. Though this will require some explanation, as I do not mean that rational argument, as in the arguments for God's existence, convinced me again to believe in God. In standing in the wood between the worlds that is agnosticism, how did I decide between two rationally competing visions, atheism and theism? There is, for me, only one answer to this question: value. In value theory, there are traditionally two subdivisions: aesthetics, the theory of beauty, and ethics. We have seen in the course of this series how important maintaining a robust notion of ethics has been in my journey. Socrates, Kant, Sartre, all taking great pains to find space for ethics, moral value, in the face of rational schemes that threaten its viability. As we human beings inhabit, at the ontological level, an ethical world, a robust sense of ethics is not something I've ever been willing to give up, on either side of the looking glass. Standing as I did in July of 2019 before my looking glass in the wood between the worlds of agnosticism, the choice between theism and atheism centralized for me the value of beauty. Life's value is in meaning. It keeps our world from crumbling around us, makes our suffering bearable, gives motivation for doing what is difficult and painful. I've become more and more convinced as I've taught philosophy through the years that rationality is best understood as a broad category encompassing everything that distinguishes humans from other animals. Not just language and logic and mental reasoning, but also the aesthetic and moral sense. To say that we are rational beings means more, much more, than mere intellect. In this sense, rationality is that spark of the divine upon which our special status stands. Meaning and beauty are allies. We human beings are storytellers. We innately seek sense, understanding, value, and are drawn to meaning and beauty. Animals are not, or at least nowhere near the level at which human beings are. Beauty, like right and wrong, is both constructed and discovered, both subjective and objective, both for itself and in itself, both, perhaps after last week you can say it with me, human and divine. One of my biggest complaints about the evangelical wing of Christendom is their narrowness on this point. All truth is God's truth. All beauty is of God. J.S. Bach understood this, as did Martin Luther. The creative impulse of human beings may be corrupted by the fall, but the works of man are inspired by that spark of the divine that inhabits every member of the human race. And God's beauty is revealed in the works of man everywhere. Effectively, there is no divide between the sacred and the secular, only between the good and the bad, the right and the wrong. The story of redemption is of surpassing beauty. And I find the Bible narrative so utterly grounded in human experience and psychological insight that I am compelled, and I can now say rationally compelled, by its narrative unity and complexity, its deceptive simplicity, its wisdom, its beauty. Standing there, in the wood between the worlds of agnosticism in July of 2019, I compared the competing narratives of atheism and theism. There is beauty in the atheist vision of the world. To say otherwise would be foolish. Atheists, too, are quite compelled by ethical considerations. It is a central focus for those that I know. Value is not absent for or from atheism in all its various forms. Atheists are, after all, human beings, possessing that same spark common to us all. As an atheist, though, my, quote, hard-headed rationality kept seeking truth through the process of demystification. Remember? The purpose of knowledge, I thought as an atheist, was to take the measure of being, to nail it down. I'm not trying to speak for all atheists here, only myself, though I suspect that this is common to most atheistic worldviews. For them, the supernatural, the unknown, the mysterious, the paradoxical and ambiguous is the enemy of truth. And if the world is less beautiful, less compelling, less meaningful without them, then so be it. It is a price worth paying. For me, though, the dichotomy of truth versus beauty was falsified. Truth is too large and complex to be put in a box by such a foolish and limited being as man. Why should it be the case that in holding to truth, I had to give up any modicum of beauty? In fact, I feel quite justified in thinking that beauty may very well be the greatest ally of truth, as my experience teaches me that those works of art, songs, painting, poems, stories, that appear most true were also most beautiful. Explicitly then, that day in July, I chose the more beautiful of the competing visions as my choice. Jenny, joy, and truth. God's life, His beauty, His way. My choice is reflected in Puddleglum's words to the Queen of Underworld in the silver chair. "One word, ma'am," he said, coming back from the fire limping because of the pain. "One word. All you've been saying is quite right, I shouldn't wonder. I'm a chap who always liked to know the worst and then put the best face I can on it, so I won't deny that any of what you said. But there's one thing more to be said, even so. Suppose we have only dreamed or made up all those things, trees and grass and sun and moon and stars and Aslan himself. Suppose we have. Then all I can say is that, in that case, the made-up things seem a good deal more important than the real ones. Suppose this black pit of a kingdom is the only world. Well, it strikes me as a pretty poor one, And that's a funny thing when you come to think of it. We're just babies making up a game, if you're right. But 4 babies playing a game can make a play world which licks your real world hollow. That's why I'm going to stand by the play world. I'm on Aslan's side, even if there isn't any Aslan to lead it. I'm going to live as like a Narnian as I can, even if there isn't any Narnia. One might attack me on this point that, as Puddleglum says, I am abandoning truth in favor of a play world because it is more appealing. In this way, I am open to the accusation of empirical idealism, of choosing a rational construction created from whole cloth by the human mind. This, I've claimed repeatedly, is the ever-present danger into which human rationality falls. What must be kept in mind, however, in this example, is that there are 2 competing visions presented as real in the metaphysical sense, as explanations of our experience. Choosing between them is a matter of faith, not knowledge. The empirical world is common to both conceptions, but only one allows for a nearly infinite richness, complexity, and beauty. Like Puddleglum, I chose beauty and meaning. My rational devotion to beauty, to Christ, compels my allegiance. The beauty and majesty of God's story is incomparable to the bleak meaninglessness of the alternatives. This is, perhaps, the clearest explanation of why the Old Testament sacrificial system remains for me problematic. Beauty merges with truth, meaning, and life in Christ in a way that engages the grit, hardship, and tragedy of human existence without falsifying it. And maybe this is the best answer to the quandary itself. Why the sacrificial system? Changing gears a little. A friend and listener has asked me to address my thoughts on the arguments for God's existence, as I have said that they served no purpose for me as I went through the looking glass. This 7-week journey has been personal and gut-wrenching for me, but enlightening as well. I do not mean to assert that all atheists are like me, or that my path back to God is what others need to follow. God meets each of us where we need to be met, I think. I studied apologetics in Bible college and on my own. I had done evangelism on the streets of Jamaica, Philadelphia, and New York, and don't forget my never-ending hunger to know everything. As a Christian, I feared someone would ask me a question I could not answer, or challenge me in a way that I could not counter. If that happened, my faith might falter, so I studied like a madman. In the end, all my knowledge and study did not prevent me from abandoning my Lord. Though to be fair, I don't think it was what caused me to do so either. Even as an atheist, I was interested in rational approaches to God, but none of them ever convinced me that atheism was false. Evidence and argument stacked up on both sides of the question for me over the years. But neither side compelled belief. I remained an atheist by default. I suppose it is possible that someone who is truly open to evidence and argument might be convinced to believe in God by evidence and argument. I suspect, though, that there is always something more going on. As I asserted in this series, God always stands outside human experience. The Bible talks about this in various ways, but one of the clearest is just the notion of faith itself. God is accessible to man only through belief. There is something here that words just can't communicate, a limitation of our humanity that puts God outside our ken, our knowledge. Still, there is a notion of transcendence that haunts us. I think that causes us to seek outside ourselves and our spatio-temporal frame. We are the only creatures who can think about our limitations as limitations, and thus conceive of an outside to our particular box, a metaphysical reality beyond our limitations. Along with this sense of something beyond our senses comes the ability to accept or reject that additional story. Faith, too, is one of those tools that rationality, the spark of the divine, imparts to us. I am reminded here of the present state of astrophysics and the positing of the multiverse. There are scientists who believe in the multiverse, right? Probably so much so that they are trying to devise experiments to test whether or not it might exist. That is, their actions are reflecting their beliefs. Watch what people do, right? Faith motivates action. So, back to the question. What value do I find in the arguments for God's existence? They're fun to engage as intellectual games, and even may help to reinforce belief for those who already believe. But I think most non-Christians, and almost certainly most atheists, who have usually thought longer and harder about these issues than most religious believers, will not find them compelling. Statistics point to the conclusion that belief in God is vastly more prevalent than atheism. So for Christians, the problem is not really convincing people to believe in God, but to place their trust in Christ. Atheists are a special case. It is Christ who won me, not an argument. It was discovering that my faith as an atheist was misplaced. That indeed I had a faith, as many atheists think of themselves as hard-headed empiricists, not as believing at all. I think that the sort of philosophical or psychological introspection that reveals how tenuous the structure of human knowledge really is vital. I may be wrong, however, on this point. It is certainly possible that some atheist somewhere is simply looking to find a good argument for God. How then to win over an atheist, if not by convincing them by argument that God exists? I don't know most atheists, but my advice is to treat each one as an individual who has real questions and concerns. There are no good hit-and-run tactics for evangelizing atheists. C.S. Lewis came to Christ through intellect and friends who believed, cared, and engaged him as an equal. Among them, J.R.R. Tolkien, a Catholic. If you care enough to engage an atheist, they're going to need the slow and steady relationship approach. Don't bother if you're just doing it to win them over, as that will be obvious to them from the start. If they're not a real friend, they'll simply have contempt for your efforts. Christians, especially evangelicals, have insulated themselves in language and thought from any thinking that departs from their own narrow conceptions. So unless you're willing to expand those narrow conceptions, think outside your box, you will be unlikely to adequately engage an atheist. Both sides, atheist and Christian, are too narrow, from my perspective, too wrapped up in their own worldview. This, too, though, is a vast oversimplification. Of the two, Christians and atheists, I tend to favor the openness of the atheist. Though where they are closed and narrow-minded, it is every bit as closed and narrow-minded as any Christian. Evangelicals are frequently too frightened that their narrow worldview will collapse if they honestly confront difficult opposition. In fact, if there were one message I would like to impart to Christians, it is on this issue. Do not be afraid of facing your doubts or those of others. If you believe God is truth, then trust Him. His truth will carry the day. If you can't answer all the arguments of the doubters, do not despair. Neither can I or anyone else. Faith in God is not beyond doubt. Doubt is part of the very essence of faith. Jacob wrestled with God, and won. His new name, Israel, became the name of his descendants, those who struggle with God. Let us too wrestle and hold on to God. We will be wounded. We can live with the limp, but not without Christ. If this is the first edition of The Christian Atheist you've seen, please subscribe to our page below to be sure not to miss any upcoming editions. You can also visit our YouTube page to catch up on past editions. First, if you like this video, please like and subscribe. And let us know what you'd like to hear from us by commenting. Wise Words for Your Occasion is located in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, but we're willing to travel. For inquiries or to book an occasion, go to wisewordsforyouroccasion.wordpress.com or see us on Facebook or check out our YouTube channel. You'll find links to all three in this post.